On August 1, 1714, Queen Anne of Great Britain consumed an enormous quantity of Blackheart cherries while paralyzed and dying in her bed at Kensington Palace. Her physicians recorded this bizarre detail with clinical precision. But no one could explain why a woman who hadn't spoken for 2 days, who couldn't move her limbs, somehow managed to eat what they called an inordinate amount of fruit in her final hours. This wasn't how monarchs were supposed to die. Not surrounded by doctors wielding hot irons and bleeding knives. Not while politicians literally grabbed her dying hand to force one last signature. And certainly not while eating cherries as her body shut down organ by organ. But then again, nothing about Queen Anne's life had followed the script. She was the woman who buried 17 children, who united England and Scotland into Great Britain, and who spent her final days as a paralyzed pawn in a game of succession that could have torn the nation apart. The date was July 30th, 1714. Kensington Palace, 7:30 in the morning. Queen Anne, aged 49, sat in her wheelchair in the council chamber, her feet wrapped in blood-stained bandages, her face swollen beyond recognition. She hadn't walked in over a year. In exactly 48 hours, she would be dead. But first, she would endure medical torture that would make the Tower of London's racks seem merciful. First, she would suffer a stroke on the exact anniversary of her only surviving child's death, July 30th, 14 years to the day. And first, she would make one final political decision while literally unable to speak. A decision that would determine whether Britain descended into civil war. To understand the horror of Queen Anne's final days, you need to understand the body that was failing her. By 1714, Anne wasn't just sick. She was a collection of failing systems, barely held together by willpower and the desperate interventions of physicians who understood less about medicine than we do about dark matter. The medical records are explicit in their brutality. Her feet had become so grotesquely swollen from what doctors called dropsy, what we'd recognize as severe edema from heart or kidney failure, that they had to be permanently wrapped in specially made bandages that servants changed multiple times daily. The used bandages were burned because the discharge and blood made them too foul to wash. But here's what made Anne's suffering uniquely horrible. She had systemic lupus erythematosus. Though the disease wouldn't be named for another century, modern physicians studying contemporary portraits can actually see the evidence. The distinctive butterfly-shaped rash across her face that artists tried to soften but couldn't fully hide. Lupus meant her own immune system was destroying her from the inside. Every pregnancy, and she had 17 of them, made it worse. Every child she lost intensified the disease's attack on her organs. 17 pregnancies. Let that number sink in. 12 ended in miscarriage or stillbirth. 5 children were born alive, 4 died within 2 years. The last one, Prince William, Duke of Gloucester, made it to 11 years old. Just long enough for Anne to believe she might have an heir. Just long enough for her to plan a future. He died on July 30th, 1700, 6 days after his 11th birthday. She never recovered from that loss. And in one of history's cruelest coincidences, she would suffer her fatal stroke on the anniversary of his death. Meanwhile, while Anne's body deteriorated, Britain was transforming into a global superpower. The War of Spanish Succession had just ended. The Duke of Marlborough's victories at Blenheim, Ramillies, and Malplaquet shattered French dominance in Europe. The Treaty of Utrecht in 1713 granted Britain Gibraltar, Newfoundland, and exclusive rights to supply slaves to Spanish America, the foundation of an empire that would last 2 centuries. And oversaw all of this while unable to walk, while enduring pain that made her scream at night, while knowing that every achievement would die with her because she had no heir. But here's what history books rarely emphasize. As Anne lay dying in July 1714, 2 separate coups were being planned in the very same palace. The Jacobites, supporters of Anne's Catholic half-brother James, had infiltrated her government at the highest levels. Her own Lord Treasurer, Robert Harley, Earl of Oxford, had been secretly corresponding with James in France. So had Viscount Bolingbroke, who wanted Oxford's job. Both men were technically committing treason, and both were standing in Anne's bedchamber as she died. On the other side, the Whigs had their own conspiracy. The Duke of Somerset and other Whig lords had essentially occupied Kensington Palace in Anne's final days. sleeping in shifts to ensure that no Jacobite could access the dying queen alone. They had already sent secret messages to Hanover, telling George Ludwig, the future George I, to prepare his invasion fleet. Yes, invasion fleet, because that's what it was. A German prince who spoke no English was preparing to sail to Britain with an army, and everyone was pretending this was a peaceful succession. The tension in those final days was suffocating. Servants reported courtiers wearing swords in the palace corridors. The guards had been quietly reinforced. Everyone knew that the moment Anne died, whoever controlled the palace would control the kingdom. And Anne knew it too. Even as strokes destroyed her ability to speak, even as physicians tortured her with their treatments, she understood that her death would trigger either a smooth transition or a bloodbath. July 24, 1714, the Privy Council meeting that started the end. Picture the scene. The council chamber at Kensington Palace. Wood-paneled walls, windows overlooking the gardens where Anne would never walk again. The Queen, weighing close to 300 pounds by this point, is wheeled in by servants. Her face is crimson and mottled, the lupus rash combined with what doctors called scorbutic spots, likely burst blood vessels. She can barely hold her head up. The meeting was supposed to be routine. Instead, it exploded. Oxford and Bolingbroke, the two most powerful men in government, started screaming at each other. Not polite political disagreement, actual shouting. Oxford accused Bolingbroke of treason. Bolingbroke accused Oxford of embezzlement. Both were probably guilty, and watched this unfold, and something inside her, maybe a blood vessel, maybe just her last reserve of strength, snapped. She collapsed forward onto the table. Not a gentle faint. A sudden, violent collapse that sent papers flying and had servants rushing to keep her from hitting the floor. They carried her to her chambers, and she never truly recovered. But here's the detail that reveals the stakes. She didn't dismiss Oxford immediately. Despite his obvious treason, despite the scene he'd caused, she waited 3 days. Why? Because dismissing him meant choosing a side in the succession crisis. It meant empowering either the Jacobites or the Hanoverians. And Anne, dying but determined, tried to maintain the balance. July 27th. Anne finally dismisses Oxford. The decision probably took years off her life. Not that she had years left, hours maybe. The stress of that confrontation triggered what physicians described as trembling in her hands, heat in the head with sleepiness, and a little bleeding at the nose. That bleeding was the first sign of the strokes to come. July 28th. Her appetite was quite lost, and her spirits sunk. She stopped eating solid food. Her ladies reported she would stare at nothing for hours, occasionally mouthing words no one could understand. The palace fell into an eerie quiet. Courtiers whispered in the hallways. Everyone was waiting. July 30th, 1714, 7 a.m., and woke on the anniversary of her son's death. The stroke hit during morning prayers. Not a gentle fading. A violent, convulsive attack that left her thrashing on the chapel floor. Blood poured from her nose. Her eyes rolled back. Her ladies screamed for the physicians, who rushed in with their instruments of torture. First, they bled her, draining pints of blood into ceramic bowls while she convulsed. Then came the cupping, the blistering, the hot irons. They shaved her head completely to apply hot poultices to the scalp. She remained conscious. The stroke took her speech, not her awareness. While Anne lay paralyzed and bleeding, the palace erupted. The Whig lords had been waiting. The Duke of Somerset guarded her chamber. But they still needed one thing from her: a final appointment to secure the succession. July 31st. They brought Charles Talbot, Duke of Shrewsbury, to Anne's bedside. Though paralyzed and speechless, the official record claimed she handed him the staff of Lord Treasurer. Private letters say her hand was guided, perhaps even physically arranged. It was effectively a coup enacted on a dying queen. But it worked. Night fell. Her breathing worsened. More treatment. More pain. And then the cherries. Blackheart cherries. An inordinate quantity. No explanation. Dawn broke gray and humid. At 7:30 a.m., with only Dr. Arbuthnot present, Queen Anne died. The physician later wrote, I believe sleep was never more welcome to a weary traveler than death was to her. The moment and died, messengers rode toward Dover. Within an hour, George Ludwig was proclaimed King George I. The Jacobites melted away. Anne's final, forced appointment had prevented civil war. Her body remained at Kensington for 3 weeks while a special coffin was built, almost square in shape due to her extreme swelling. 14 men carried it to Westminster Abbey on August 24th. She was buried beside her husband, Prince George, surrounded by the remains of her 17 children, an entire extinct dynasty in one vault. Her funeral effigy, made from her death mask, still exists. The swelling is visible. The suffering is there, preserved in wax. Today, we understand her death in medical terms: lupus, strokes, kidney failure, heart failure. Her treatments hastened her end. The barbarism was ignorance, not cruelty. But the most human detail remains the cherries. Because beyond the crown, beyond the politics, beyond the agony, there was a woman reaching for something sweet in her final moments. Dr. Arbuthnot was right. Death came to and like sleep to a weary traveler. After 49 years of pain, after burying everyone she loved, the last Stuart monarch died broken in body but unbroken in will, having held her kingdom together until her very last breath. Even if that breath had to be forced from her paralyzed body by the ambitions of the men around her.